I'm Mike,
And I'm Amber. Welcome to the Covenant Chronicles,
where we tell you the truth about relationships,
giving you the tools to build the foundation you always needed. Welcome back to the Covenant Chronicles.
Why, hello.
It's sunny while we're recording today.
Yeah, it's a little weird recording in the day instead of at 10 o'clock at night.
I kind of like it. The sun beaming through the windows and the birds chirping outside. It's kind of nice.
I guess.
I know. I'm a weirdo. I like that stuff.
Yeah, I was also laughing because I just watched a video of this wife talking about her dressing up for her husband, so he'll stay up with her all night, and she has a big box that's hanging around her neck that says Claude on it, which is just really funny given the context of the past week. Anyways.
Yeah. Is that what we're talking about today?
We could talk about all the amazing AI stuff we've been digging into.
Yeah, sure. That.
No, what I do want to talk about actually is I would like to talk about expressing frustrations and kind of the do's and don'ts around that. I was thinking about it, and we had an issue Saturday where we had some disagreements, and it was around it was initiated by expressing frustrations. However, the manner in which they were expressed was not, I guess, the best way to go about it, which then triggered things, which then created the cycle of kind of going back and forth. And the point basically being completely missed, at which point there was, how would I say it, accusations, I guess, of some past stuff that was brought up, which the issue with that is the frustrations were all stemmed around trying to create different outcomes to begin with.
Uh-huh.
And that sounds like a really complex, cryptic way to say, well, we didn't communicate well. It caused us to have some disagreement, and it triggered some past things for us, which then we had to work through and come back to the place of, okay, this is not that. And I wanted to talk about that because, looking through it, I mean, the situation was, or could have been, for one, much worse. It also could have been much better. And this is where, we talk about all the time about there's not a level of perfection that you're going to reach inside of your relationship. But what does make it a perfect relationship is the fact that you continue to work through things and you continue to actually strive to move forward. And so with that, what we experienced was something that we talk about regularly, and that's where, just simply not being able to communicate clearly can lead to challenges, right? And so actually being able to hear your partner and, going back to some of the stuff that we've talked about in the past, like the, 1 Corinthians, not holding on to past wrongs and this sort of thing, really become crucial. And the reason why is because, in that situation, I had expressed some frustrations. I expressed the frustrations not necessarily because I wanted to beat the dead horse on something that we talked about, a bunch of times. But I expressed frustrations because there was some things that, I had done in the past that had basically made you feel a certain type of way. And with that, it was this, I'm trying to do something different and I'm trying to act different, and I'm frustrated because I feel like when I try, there's something that always gets in the way, right? And instead of expressing it in that manner, it was expressed very much in the same manner that I've expressed the frustration around this topic quite a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue is because of that, it caused you to kind of instantaneously put up this wall and shut down. And then I get more frustrated because now I feel like, hey, you're not actually listening to me. And then we ended up in this, I guess, circle or spiral for a little bit where, it wasn't anything major and it wasn't, like it, I guess, ruined our day or anything like that, but for a few moments, like we did kind of go back and forth and we started letting things go a different direction. And what's so interesting about this is, we've talked about it before, and these occasions are pretty rare for us, but they do happen, right? And in light of everything that's occurred the last couple of weeks and just really the massive shifts, and the massive changes and the spiritual attacks that have occurred and all this sort of stuff, when you really look at it, right, like the situation could have been 10 times worse. And, in our previous relationships, it probably would have lasted for days, in the beginning of our relationship, it would have lasted hours, right? Like there was a lot of stuff that, okay, this could have gone much worse. But I also wanted to address it and talk about, how in the process of this, and really express the fact that we've said, it is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And there will be times throughout your lives and throughout your relationship where sometimes things will come up and you have to navigate those and you're going to have to work through them. And if, you choose to default back to previous programs, it can throw you guys back into the same cycles, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly the point of trying to avoid all of this, right? Or not avoid, but building the tools and the knowledge and the understanding to be able to navigate these things so that you can actually work through these things and not end up in the same cycles, not end up going to the past, not end up doing things that are going to, be hurtful to your partner, not do things that are going to leave lasting scars on the relationship, right? And create a situation where, you can actually communicate and work through situations like this in a healthy way that allows you to progress forward, right? Because as we always say, every, interaction with your partner is an opportunity for connection or disconnection. And the manner in which you choose to conduct that interaction is going to dictate which way it goes.
Yeah. uh, yeah, it kind of got to a point that, like, I noticed that it wasn't going to be effective communication anymore. And so, this is something we've talked about before, but honestly, we have a hard time doing it even in our relationship, is like when you notice that pausing and like stepping away and either coming back to readdress things at a later time, or, maybe you like work it out and you're like, I really like, we don't necessarily need to talk about this again. You know, I was just feeling a certain way and that's what it was. But anyways, we kind of got to that point, and I did have to a couple times be like, we need to stop this conversation because it's not going in the direction that we want it to go. And if we keep going, it's just going to get worse. And I think we haven't really been able to do that effectively in the past, but I think that even though it was hard for us to pause at that moment because we're not used to doing that, actually like pausing and taking that time and being like, hey, we can come back to this later or we can just let it go, but we need to stop this conversation, was actually good.
Mm-hmm.
In that moment. And I think that's so hard for people to do because we all feel like, especially when we're in those cycles with our partner, like, I need to get my point across, my voice needs to be heard, or if I don't like fix this right this second, then it's it's not ever going to get fixed. Like, there's so many different like mindsets behind why we do it. But I think a lot of it stems back to probably fear, to be honest. Like, just fear that either you're not being heard, fear that, they're going to walk away and not return, or not return to the conversation. Like, there's a lot of fear behind not pausing an argument when you're in one. But I think what people don't understand is, like, when you actually pause and give yourself time to come down from those current emotions and process what was just talked about and the things that were just said, it allows you to really think through whether that conversation needs to continue, and a more positive way to continue it, or to just come back and be like, hey, I don't think we really need to like continue talking about this, but I'm sorry, that I said some things that weren't true, or whatever the case might be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because truthfully, we didn't really go back to the conversation that we had. However, I will say, like, later that night, I kind of brought it up in just the manner that I was like, I'm sorry that, that wasn't good communication. And that's not, like, I hear what you're saying. And then we had another conversation that was a little bit deeper, getting to like actual frustrations that we're just having in general, which I think can also be the case when people get into arguments, is that it's not even about that argument in that moment,
Right.
but deeper frustrations that are not being said or talked about.
Right. Well, and that's, I mean, the situation that we had dealt with, I mean, that was exactly it, right? Is like, well, on the surface level, it was, well, I'm frustrated about, X. And then because I'm frustrated about X, you got frustrated about Y, right? And the reality was the frustration wasn't even about X, right? It was about A, B, and C, right?
Yeah.
And so when you look at that situation, and it was this frustration, right? In the sense that, well, I guess the easiest way to, explain it is, in the we do have this dynamic where we deal with two sets of kids. Both you and I have a set of kids from previous marriages. And, in the past, you felt like maybe I was inconsistent in, the way that I wanted to spend time and go and do things with, basically each set of kids. And so with that part of, that, and I guess having attention on that subject was finding things to do, and my frustration was really about the fact of like, hey, it seems like when we try to go do things out of the house, like we don't have the proper tools, not because we haven't gotten the proper tools, but because they end up at the other parent's house and never come back. Right.
Yeah.
And so my frustration was, hey, I just want to be able to go and do this without it being a giant production to try and make it work, because I'm trying to go do things with, this set of kids. And in the past, we've also had, which to be honest with you, has been the core of why I get frustrated with that situation in general. However, the way in which I typically express this is me being annoyed at the fact that stuff didn't come back from the other parent's house, which would not necessarily be a big deal if it was easy to, hey, okay, let's just, text the other parent. We can have the stuff here in like, 10, 15 minutes. Okay, no big deal. But that's never the case, right? And so I have not in the past had a good way to express like, hey, this is frustrating to me because, part of why, it's a struggle for me to plan things out with, basically this set of kids versus that set of kids is whether, how much truth is actually behind it, or whether it's just my perception, or, whether there's some truth and some of it's just perception, is that whenever we try, whenever I try, it's always a production of like, well, we don't have the proper tools or equipment or gear to go do this because it never made its way back from the other parent's house, which is discouraging for me to try and do this because, right? And instead of being able to express that in that manner and say, hey, this is important to me. This is, we need to figure out a little bit better solution to this because, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm discouraged to do this stuff, sometimes because this plays a factor. Historically, I have just expressed it as a frustration, right? And without having the context of, hey, this is why I'm trying to do this. This is why this is important to me, right? And what I will say is sometimes when you're communicating with your partner, you don't, your partner should be able to just say, okay, this is probably important to them. And, I need to respect my partner's wishes because it is important to them. However, what I will say is that in the communication cycle, the more that you can give context, and that doesn't mean you necessarily have to over explain every situation that you try to communicate with your partner, but the more you can give context, and instead of saying, oh, I'm annoyed, or being like, hey, this pisses me off, or hey, this annoys me, right? Which will tend to create an instantaneous wall between you guys, actually communicating and saying, hey, I'm bothered by this. This is really important to me. Here's why it's important to me. Gives a completely different context to maybe why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. And when you express that to your partner in those manner, it changes the dynamic about communication, right? And what tends to happen with that type of communication ends up being your partner understanding and saying, oh, okay, like I didn't realize that before, or, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? And they're a lot more open to like, okay, let's find some middle ground, or yeah, let's work together to come up with a solution to this because, well, you've expressed, hey, this is important to me and here's why, as opposed to just this is annoying or this is pissing me off, right? Which can tend to, like in our case, of course, it put up a wall. It was perceived as, me being critical of like your actions or stuff that you do, right? Which
Yeah.
is something that you struggle with, which then triggered things in you, which then created a reaction, which then created a cycle where, I'm like, why are you not understanding what I'm trying to say, right? Instead of me realizing like, okay, well, maybe I've expressed this wrong, right? And then we end up in this cycle of kind of back and forth where you're triggered, I'm annoyed because I'm not being heard, right? And we just end up in this spiral and where we're just like on a hamster wheel of not actually getting anywhere.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's typically what happens. And I expressed to you last night, like, I sometimes have trouble communicating my exact feelings about things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, in my head, it makes sense, but then when I try to explain it to you, I'm like, not great at really explaining how I'm feeling at that particular time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is what ends up happening a lot in these issues of communication is sometimes we have this really great laid out thought and plan in our head of what to say, but actually expressing it to your partner, it doesn't come across the same way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then that can bring up walls and, trigger feelings and create issues that really didn't need to be created. It's just we weren't communicating the way that we should.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, in our relationship, like, that is, like, I'm working on being able to also be able to communicate better about how I'm feeling about certain things so that we can communicate more effectively with each other. And it's not this situation of where I'm just, you know, getting triggered and feeling these things and then just shutting down, which is what I tend to do in those
Right.
situations.
Right. Well, and that's, the reality is that, at the base level of the connection versus disconnection, it comes back to the communication, right? And the communication probably, well, not probably, communication does stem from, the mindset behind things. And, when I go back and I look at, okay, this situation, how did I communicate? Well, you know, my intention was to say, hey, this bothers me because it's important to me that we be able to spend time and go do things outside the house with your kids. And we do live in a place where outside activities aren't necessarily walking to a park. They can be, we do have parks, but it's, outside activities, where you and I were both born, I guess, or grew up, right, is very different. Well, grew up for you because I grew up here, but it's very different. Outside activities are, in the summertime, you're going fishing, you're going hunting, you're going, off-roading, whether it's on four-wheelers or side-by-sides or Jeeps, or you're going out in the woods, and you're doing these things. And the weather isn't always the best. Like sometimes it's sunny and hot, and it's 80 degrees. Sometimes it's pouring rain, right? And like, and then we get to the winter time and, outdoor activities aren't, hey, let's go for a walk. Like they certainly can be, but for the most part, your outdoor activities are, you're going, whether you're going skiing or you're hiking these trails that are slushy and snowy and icy, or, you're playing hockey, or you're going sledding, or you're riding snowmobiles or snow machines or sleds, depending on where you're from, without trying to start a debate over here, over proper labels, or, you're downhill skiing or snowboarding or whatever have you, right? And so all of these activities do require, proper gear, proper attire, proper, tools. And for me, I like to be able to just say, hey, let's go do this today, right? Even if it's not something that necessarily costs us money right now, it's, hey, let's go and do this. And so, when I look back on it being like, hey, well, this is frustrating to me because I would like to be able to go just do this and take the kids to go and do things. And, to do that, we need to have the gear, the proper tools and stuff, which in a lot of cases we have invested in. And when we don't have those, it's discouraging to me because it doesn't ever seem like, uh, that with, one set of the kids does it. I would say that we struggle with it with both sets of kids when stuff goes back and forth between the two houses, right? But it would seem as though it is much easier to, hey, for one, everything is at our house. And if it happened to make it to the other parent's house, it's very easy typically to be like, hey, I need to acquire this. Like, can we make that happen? Typically within, less than an hour, that is able to happen versus the other set of parents, it's not quite as easy, right? Like it is a whole production. And instead of just expressing, hey, I've expressed this before. This is why this is important to me. I like to be able to do this. I want to be able to go spend time as a family outdoors doing these things. To do that, we need the proper tools and equipment and gear, which we have spent time and money and resources acquiring. And it's very, upsetting to me when I can't go do stuff that I would like to do with the kids because it's a whole production to try and acquire this. So, hey, can we figure out a different solution to this moving forward, right? That is a very different conversation than the same conversation we've had, probably 5, 6, 8, 10 times now of this pisses me off or this annoys me, right? Even if you change the ver or the words that are used, right? Instead of, hey, this pisses me off, this annoys me, right? Why, and the next words are, why is this an issue again? That is a very different conversation in which the same things are attempted to be, or the same things are trying to be expressed. However, the friction that is created, the walls that go up, and the assumptions that are made simply in the way that you communicate in those initial, communication can make a massive difference in the outcome of that, right? And like we always talk about, like, it's going to be connection or disconnection, right? The first way I explain that creates a situation of connection, because in that scenario, right, your response to that would probably be, oh man, like he really like wants to spend time with the kids. That's important to me. That's important to him. That's important to our family. Like, okay, let's work together. Maybe we can figure out a different solution here. Versus the second way is shutting down because you're being criticized, right?
Yeah.
And those are two very different outcomes when you're really just saying the same things.
Yeah. But my point kind of was to take it even deeper, that like at the end of the day when we talked about it, like that wasn't even really the point of frustration. Like it was, but there was deeper stuff that was going on between both of us that was causing this particular issue to be more of an issue than it probably needed to be.
Right. Which
And
is like for you, that a big part of that was the disconnection, right? So you felt very disconnected and emotionally disconnected, which of course, when we get to those points of disconnection, does tend to create more friction inside of our relationship.
yeah, I was just wanting to point out and show as well that like I think a lot of times, like, yeah, there's this surface level stuff, and like you were um bothered, upset, whatever you want to say, by it, and we didn't communicate that super well, and it could have been communicated better. But there was even a deeper level and layer of stuff that was happening between us that was causing that particular issue to be more of an issue. And so I think, like, if people take the time to stop and actually kind of assess what's going on inside themselves in those moments, like, is that actually the issue, or is there some underlying issues that are causing this to be more of an issue than it needs to be? And like you said, like for us, it's just been that we've had a lot going on the last couple of weeks. And in the fact that there's been a lot going on in the last couple of weeks, there's been disconnection between us, and there's been, just feelings that we both have had about ourselves and identity, and those things have caused there to be disconnection between us. But at the like deeper level, because we were feeling disconnected and not feeling like one unit at that time, we let some surface level thing become a bigger issue than it needed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that happens a lot in relationships, and people don't even realize it because they're just focused on that surface level thing that's happening, and why, they're getting so frustrated about that one surface level thing. And while better communication about that surface level thing is super important, and I agree with what you're saying, and how you say it and deliver it is important, and it could change the way that you have those moments of frustration. But also taking the time to, if you don't recognize it in that moment of having that frustration with each other, but pausing and then being able to look at the bigger picture and be like, oh, well, actually, we're feeling these things, which are causing this to be an issue, but it's actually this underlying stuff. I think it's important to be able to like take that time to evaluate what else is going on and why it could be potentially making other things bigger than they need to be at that moment.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's, I think, really important. Like I said, a lot of it has to do with that communication, though, and before you choose to communicate with your partner about something that's going on or a frustration that you have, I think it is important that you take a step back and analyze, like, okay, why am I feeling this way? What is the root cause of this? And we can get even deeper, like you said, like for me, part of the frustration, for you, you've been feeling very disconnected. I've obviously been feeling like that. You and I have been feeling like we've failed in a lot of ways recently, right? And so, like, when you look at it, it's like, okay, well, why was this such a big deal? Well, like I said, I want to be able to take the kids to go do things. Okay, well, why is that? What's the deeper level of the issue here? Okay, well, the issue is, like, I'm trying to do something and it feels like a failure point because I'm not able to go do something that, I want to do, that's important to me and important to our family. Okay, well, why is that such a big challenge? Well, when you look at, there's all these other ways that we feel like we've been failing, lately, then it starts adding up of like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Now it's not just, this over here. It's not just, okay, well, is this really that big of a deal, right? It's all these other situations of like, okay, it just compiled on top of it to make, me feel a certain way, or like, hey, I can't, do this, or I can't, complete something that I said we were going to complete with the family because of, XYZ, right? And so, like you said, that analyzing the deeper reasons behind why you're feeling a certain way before you express that frustration can turn into, a much better way to handle things that will lead to connection, because I will say that's one thing is that, we do handle situations, communication better than, probably 99% of people. However, we do still fail. We do slip up sometimes, and we continue to learn things from that situation, right? But like you said, then it becomes this thing later where, well, we took this place or this situation in which we did, kind of miss the mark as far as how we should have handled things. And we actually used it to lead into better communication and a deeper communication later in the day, right? And really being able to express how we're feeling, why we're feeling things, and what really brought us to that point.
yeah. There's a lot to unpack and process.
Yeah, on that note, I think the task for the week. Well, we have a bunch of changes coming. I think the next podcast we do, we're actually going to just talk about changes. So that's going to be our main focus, is that. But while that is occurring, the task for this week is to take your last disagreement with your partner or your spouse. And I want you to get a piece of paper and a writing utensil and take the time to sit down and actually write out and go on a deeper level, and each level that you seem to reach. So for example, you were having a disagreement and, like this situation. Okay, the disagreement was, kids' outdoor gear not coming back to the house. Okay, well, then I want you to take it a step further. Why is that a problem for you? Why do you feel like it was an issue? And then I want you to take it a step further once you define that why. And I want you to write down the feelings around that why. And then the last step is I want you to take those feelings now and I want you to deep dive into why you create those feelings. Where do those feelings stem from? What in your life, what is something that you struggle with personally that actually leads to those feelings? Because there's something in your personality, in your identity that you struggle with or are currently struggling with that leads to those emotions. And I want you to figure out what that is and just unpack this for yourself and what led you to this so you can have a deeper understanding of yourself when you go into the next big discussion with your partner.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, well, until the next podcast, we shall talk to you then.
All right, then.
Bye.
Bye.